I've always been the kind of girl that hid my face, so afraid to tell the world what I've got to say. But I have this dream right inside of me. I'm gonna let it show. It's time to let you know. It's to let you know. This is real, this is me. I'm exactly where to be now. Gonna let the light shine on me. Now I found who I am. There's no way to hold it in. No more hiding who I wanna be. This is me. What you want, baby, I got it. What you need, you know I got it. All I'm asking is for a little respect when you come home. Just a little bit, hey, baby, just a little bit. Oh, just a little bit, mister, just a little bit. I ain't gonna do you wrong while you're gone. I ain't gonna do you wrong 'cause I don't wanna. All I'm asking is for a little respect when you come home. Just a little bit, baby, just a little bit. Oh, just a little bit, just a little bit. I'm about to give you all my money, and all I'm asking in return, honey, is to give me my breakfast when you get home. Just a little bit, baby, just a little bit. Oh, just a little bit, just a little bit. Ooh, your kisses, sweeter than honey. And guess what? So is my money. All I want you to do for me is give it to me when you get home. Yeah, baby, whip it to me. Just a little bit now, just a little bit. R-E-S-P-E-C-T, find out what it means to me. R-E-S-P-E-C-T, T-K-T-C-T. Sock it to me, sock it to me, sock it to me, little rich say. Sock it to me, sock it to me, sock it to me. Woo, yeah, little bit, little rich say. Just a little bit. I get tired. Just a little bit. Keep on trying. Just a little bit. You're running out of food. Little bit. I ain't lying. Just a little bit. Please stop me when you come home. While you stay walking.
Dr. Jeff Stevenson, Vice President of Student Services at American River College. I use the pronouns he, him, his. American River College is a proud sponsor for a second year of the summit. On behalf of our college president, Melanie Dixon, our Vice President of Instruction, Dr. Frank Kobayashi, our Vice President of Administrative Services, Ku Vang, we want to take this opportunity to welcome you to the conference and also wish you a wonderful summit. In this country, there's a lot of discriminatory laws that are being passed against many in our community. And we must take this opportunity to stand together and work together to fight for the rights of all of our students administrators, faculty, and staff in the LGBTQ community. Again, we wish you a wonderful conference and thank you for this opportunity.
Perfect. And so while I get Emily to fix that for us, I want to welcome everyone to the second day of the California Community Colleges LGBTQI Plus Summit. As you all know, this is the 4th annual of this summit. And so we hope that your first day was just as incredible as it will be today. I hope you enjoy all the regional networking sessions that we had in store for you yesterday, and then also our keynote speaker with Bambi Salcedo. Before we get started, I would like to remind everyone about some housekeeping situations that we have going on since we are in a webinar type of scenario. I do want to let you all know that you all have been muted, and also your cameras have been you have been muted so that we can actually go about moving on with the conference without any hiccups. I also wanted to invite you all for your involvement throughout the summit by using our chat feature, where our presenters will be responding to your comments and your questions as well. Also, the recordings for this summit will become available on our app 2 weeks after today. And so also for those of you who are using the closed captions, if you would like to also mute them, you can also go ahead and do so by pressing the feature that is there on your computer as well. So now I will hand it off to my colleague, Emily.
We just wanted to take a quick moment again to thank our sponsors and to recognize our silver sponsors this morning. So thank you, Fresno City College, Irvine Valley College Pride Scholars, Mount San Jacinto College, De Anza College, and Young Adults Fighting Tobacco. Again, to all of our sponsors, we thank you so much for your continued support.
Of course, and I mean, we couldn't have done any of this without your sponsorship. So thank you for everyone who is in the room, who did contribute it to our sponsorship to make sure that this is possible. The other thing I do want to remind everyone is that we do have our wonderful, fabulous Jocelyn, who is our drag queen, who is going to be hosting our lip sync competition. All of you should have gotten something like this in the mail that you can use throughout that session. And so there will be a first, second, and third prize. And then there will also be a section of the part where you will all be able to also come together, sing along to one of our favorite songs that we will leave off for a surprise at the end. Also, you will have the opportunity to vote for your favorite contestant as well. And then just some last quick reminders. I do want to let everybody know that we are on Instagram and also Facebook. I don't know, Emily, if it's showing up on the screen, but it's not showing on my end. But I would like everybody to invite you to follow us through our Instagram and also our Facebook platform. If you wish to know the latest news of our summit as well. And then with that being said, I don't know if we were able to fix that, Emily. It doesn't appear like we were able to, but I can quickly tell you, if you follow us on Instagram, our handle is, I can quickly look for it. It's CCC_LGBTQ Summit. And that's how you can find us on Instagram. And that is also connected to our Facebook page. So again, it's CC_LGBTQ Summit, if you wish to know the latest, and then also what's coming for next year's summit. And now, without further ado, I'll hand it off to my colleague, Emily Mitchell, who's going to be introducing our keynote speaker for today.
Thank you. Sorry, I'm trying to make everything happen at once, and I see it advancing the slides, but I'm not sure if everybody else does. So hopefully what you see in front of you is a picture of Dr. Daisy Gonzalez. Because we are short on time and we have a lot of stuff that we want to get through this morning, I'm going to encourage everyone to look at Dr. Gonzalez's bio in our app. Her story is rather remarkable. She has done amazing and fantastic things. I do just want to let everyone know, because this is pretty cool, she's a former Aspen Institute Rising President Fellow, serves as the Commissioner of Accrediting Commission of California Commission for Community and Junior Colleges, and is the co-founder of the Sacramento Latina Leaders Network and the California Community Colleges Women's Caucus. In recognition of her leadership throughout the COVID-19 pandemic, this year or last year in 2021, she won the Woman of the Year award from the California Legislative Women's Caucus. We had a fantastic conversation just last week, and we're now going to go ahead and watch that, where she gives a lot of feedback and interesting insights into where she sees the system moving from here. Dr. Gonzalez, first, I want to thank you so much for making time for us today and for agreeing to speak and have this conversation with me. If you're okay, I'm going to just go ahead and start jumping into the questions, and we'll just have a conversation about where the system is going in terms of serving queer and trans students and how you see the place of serving queer and trans students in the mission of the State Chancellor's Office. So first and foremost, just as a little bit of background, your life story is rather remarkable among those at the highest levels of power and influence in our education system, right? It's very different from those at the highest levels of power and very similar to many of the students that we serve, right? So can you tell us a little bit about your lived experience and then how these experiences have informed your understanding of social justice and your work as the Deputy Chancellor?
Well, thank you so much for having me, Dr. Mitchell. It's just incredible to join folks virtually in community. And I can't tell you enough about how much I actually appreciate this modality. And what I mean by that, that it's a conversation and not a speech. Because I can tell you about what we're doing, but at the core, and I think what folks and our colleagues need to understand is that this work is about a conversation. We don't need to have a personal identity and connection to every single part of who other people are, but we do have to have a willingness to learn, to listen, and to change. That is what's at the core of serving students in this system. I'm grateful for the question, but I also just want to highlight that I don't think my story is that unique. And of course, most of us would probably think that in leadership. But what I mean by that is, in order to be unapologetic about our LGBTQ+ students, at the core of what we are doing, no matter what your identity is about designing a student-centered system. For me and my own journey, every part of me and who I show up as every single day, the career choices that I've made, the solutions that I create, my life's purpose, at least how I believe it is today, because it changes every single day. It's really about what we have in common. And what I mean by that is, the vision for success sets a very clear goal. We have to close equity gaps, not only close them, but erase them forever. In fact, it says within 10 years. It also, that's goal number 5. And then it also calls us to eliminate regional gaps. What's really important here is that at the heart, being unapologetic about LGBTQ+ student success, that is exactly what we're talking about. And when we talk about diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility, this is what we are talking about. It's the same thing for the call to action. It's the urgent actions that we need to take. But I know many of you know my story, and that story really starts in the foster care system. And for me, our LGBTQ+ students, our foster youth, our students with disabilities, our adult learners, our students of color, they have more in common. They are underrepresented in our data, and that's just by data collection and design, right? And in outcomes, successful outcomes. And so when I think about my story, my journey, I see a lot of commonalities, right? Not having systems that are designed for individuals like us to succeed, feeling like we don't have agency or power, and yet we do. We have so much. And being able to turn tragedy and feelings of not belonging into a source of power, right? Because we are powerful. I grew up in the San Fernando Valley and I came from a family of immigrant parents. And like many of our students, have a long history of having violence in the home, abuse. And that really has carried me through and made me who I am. I was an English learner until the 4th grade, and I ended up becoming a 3rd grade teacher because that was such an important year for me. And what is not a surprise for many students is that for anyone that comes from a family that is maybe not the safest, then our schools, the people who serve us, our faculty, our staff, become the safest place we could ever go to. It's a part of why I entered education as a professional, part of why I became a 3rd grade teacher, right? I remember I was the only one at home. I entered the foster care system 5 different times. And every time I was returned, I was the one that knew how to write in cursive. I knew math. I was responsible for writing checks at home. So I knew how to pay the bills by 2nd grade. I mention this because for many of our LGBTQ plus students, they haven't had that family and they became adults much sooner than most individuals. So despite coming from this journey, this experience, and understanding that it's not safe at home, that's really what drives me and what drives this commitment to making sure that our students feel like they belong, that they feel safe, that they feel like they have a place of learning. And so for us as scholars, as colleagues, as innovators of education, then our real work and the responsibility is removing those barriers, removing microaggressions that erode a sense of belonging, of safety, of students being able to learn and succeed. That's at the core of what I do every single day, and how that experience has really impacted my life.
Thank you for sharing that. And, just to circle back, we know that national research shows us that, in fact, LGBTQ plus individuals are far more likely to be in the foster care system. And also there was a very recent article, I believe I read it in the New York Times, that showed that violence rates, something that you also talked about, went up during the pandemic in teenagers' homes. And specifically, those members of the queer and trans communities reported even higher levels of physical and emotional violence in their home. And just as you so eloquently spoke, our campuses often serve as the one place our students can show up as who they are and have the opportunity to be seen and to be validated. So I want to thank you for sharing that and for recognizing just how similar our experiences are and what our goals are as a community. So thinking about that, can you talk a little bit about the steps that our system has begun to take to better serve queer and trans students? And just a couple I wanted to touch on, and you've already sort of mentioned it, is one, the $10 million that's been allocated to the system, right? We've been doing some webinars around that and some work around that. And also really, and you really talked about this around data collection, what are some of the efforts we're making to do a better job of collecting data, not only for our queer and trans communities, but many of our underrepresented communities who go unseen in the data picture?
Thank you for that question. It reminds me when we started our diversity, equity, and inclusion and accessibility work, a lot of our system experts kept saying, this is not a moment, this is a movement. That is exactly how we should think about this summit. We have kind of reached a little tiny point of what it's going to take to really empower and better serve LGBTQ plus students. And so this is really that movement to where we need to go. But yes, there's a lot of excitement, but I do want to mention and just acknowledge other pieces of why we need to do more before I talk about where we are today. There is an extremely long history of marginalization of LGBTQ plus people in this country, and our students are a part of this society. We know system-wide, because of the data that we're collecting and national data, that nearly 17% of our students in higher education identify as being gay, lesbian, bisexual, asexual, queer, or questioning. And then we also know that 1.7% of students who are transgender, non-binary, and questioning face additional levels of violence. We also see increases of students who identify as queer and transgender globally. And we are a system that serves everyone that comes to our doors. And we are so proud of that. But when it comes to our data, we need to understand that because we have not created a safe society, a safe world, and safe campuses, we need to understand that this is underreporting the reality and who people are. So I want to thank you for mentioning that as well, right? This is about making sure that our students can show up as themselves. And so until we begin to do that work, and that's the structural, the cultural work that we need to be doing, our students will continue to face violence and harassment, and we will not be a part of the solution of what helps them get there. So for us, as we think about this, as we think about how these students are also then marginalized through health insurance companies, right, are then impacted by worse situations in terms of housing, in terms of hunger, that is all interconnected and what's at the core of the vision for success and where we need to be as a system. We also know that as we think about where we are now, that an investment of a $10 million one-time investment is a great opportunity, but it is not enough. What do I mean by that? Last year, there was in the state budget, Assembly Bill 132, there was $10 million one time that was allocated to the system. While a historic moment, we have to remember it is a movement, right? Not a moment. What it meant was that our colleges and districts would now have targeted funding to be able to support intentionally. How is that being deployed? That's about $15,000 per college. I can't think of anyone that thinks that that is what our students deserve. But I mention that here because that's where we are. And so in order to turn this into a movement, it's about what we do with those resources. And everything that we do has to be about case making. And we cannot create a case without creating an impact. So how are we changing student outcomes? That is what we need to be doing as a result of a one-time investment. So to the extent that our colleges use those resources, $15,000 will go to their college to be able to expend immediately. The other percentage of the funding was also then set aside so that we can fund headcount. Those communities that are excelling, where our students are actually attending and identifying with this community and can be better served, we will use that data to help inform a next iteration, to help really focus on serving this population. But I want to make sure that as we think about a movement, that we don't lose sight of what it actually means on a campus, right? So on a campus, these resources and others need to be braided. This is about evidence-based decision making. Yes, the funds can be used for professional development. And if you're not already doing that, nothing should have stopped you from doing that. Nothing. That is at the core of what it means to do equity work. These resources can also be used for mental health services, but there are also other resources that can help us do this. In fact, there are mental health centers that were funded in last year's budget as well, and additional resources for our students. All of that should be integrated. This money can also be used for emergency housing. Again, there are other resources, right, in the state budget. And so I want to encourage our colleagues, our experts, to really think about it this way. I also want to mention just the importance, because I've heard from a lot of students, a Lavender graduation, that safe space to celebrate in community, what it means to graduate in this space. Those dollars can be used for that as well. Bringing speakers. Sometimes you cannot become what you don't know exists. And so spaces like this and other events and workshops are really powerful for our students, and these dollars can be used for that. But again, they should not be the only dollars that we use to support these students. So the reality of these funds and what should happen next and where we are today as a system is we are using these resources, hopefully, for urgent action and for case making. What did we change that we can point to about the impact of these resources and where we need to spend next? And the where we need to spend next is really universal design. How are you braiding your resources to better serve all students and designing with the student in mind? And if this sounds familiar, it's because it's guided pathways. So it should be no surprise to anyone. The other big part of the work system-wide has been better data collection. We know that a lot of our campuses are under-resourced in terms of research and data. that our system needs additional support for technology. But that's not what I'm talking about here. When we don't collect the data and ask the questions, the real questions, and collect the data that actually matters to our students, then they are invisible and we are not designing for them. So it wasn't until very recently that we added a question to our CCC Apply that would help us identify these students, but nothing else should stop you from adding additional questions to any of your campus surveys, leading focus groups. That is all data collection, right? Including a classroom climate, the data that you collect in your classroom about whether your students felt a sense of belonging, not just by your own teaching, but by the curriculum or the speakers that you brought to your class. That's all data collection. We are doing a lot better in terms of statewide data. The goal here is really to collect the information to use it for design and then deliver on structural transformations. And so what's really important here is we are going to be thinking about this as a movement. And the movement is about validating, seeing, and hearing our LGBTQ plus students, not just staying stuck on a one-time appropriation.
Yeah, and you know what, I'm really struck by what you're talking about there, because I think this is the system-wide conversation we're having around equity work and reducing opportunity gaps in general, right? Is that so much of the work ends up happening in silos as opposed to an integrated approach where, because the reality is for every single person, meaning each of us as an individual, and every student we serve, we hold a host of identities and we live in many different roles, right? This sort of idea of intersectionality, right? We hold lots of identities and those various identities then interact with how we interact with the system. And yet the way that we've often operated as a system is looking at one facet and then looking at a different one, as if people aren't both queer and trans and former foster youth, or Regent scholars and queer and trans students, right? We don't look at people as a whole. And so I think what we hope at the summit, for those of us who are doing this work, is that we are in every conversation, right? We are in every conversation that talks about student success. Well, how are our queer and trans students doing? Every conversation about retention. Also looking at those fine differences. So if you look at some of the research, what you'll see is course success doesn't look so bad. You look at retention, particularly for our trans umbrella term, right? So our transgender, non-conforming, non-binary students, we see lots of high numbers of folks leaving their campuses, right? Because they don't find a place they belong. They feel as though they are unwelcomed. And some of the things you talked about, Lavender graduation, speaker series, being integrated into media representations on your campuses, right? And you're absolutely right that the next effort is, how do we sustain this moving forward? $10 million is great, right? My district, which is Los Rios Community College District, we're going to get some money and that's helpful, but it will not change everything. So how do we take that and the momentum of that and dig deep into every single aspect of the campus and the culture? So thank you for that. And I'm going to skip around just a little bit, if that's okay for you. If you want me to circle back, that's totally fine. But you really hit on something that I wanted to talk a little bit more about, which is this idea that if students need to see what they can be. Right? Can't be what you can't see. And so the idea of then, how do we as a system then also better recruit and retain and promote our talented queer and trans employees, right? Because it's powerful for a student. It's powerful to see someone who holds an aspect of your identity at the front of the room or leading a division or the president of a college. And so what are we doing as a system? How are we thinking about that? How are we really cultivating this untapped talent pool?
This is so important. You know, we all carry all of these different identities, and depending on where we feel safe, we share them. Where we feel safe, and that's really important. So not only are we underreporting and collecting data for our students, but also our faculty and staff. And that's really important as we think about redesigning. We can't expect that to change for our students if it doesn't change for the leaders who are leading it. And every single one of us are leaders. That's how our students see us. They see their faculty, you're a leader. They see their classified financial aid office, you're a leader, right? That is how they see us as adults. I mentioned earlier that this work is about learning, being willing to listen, and to create change. That's what it means to serve. As we think about this work, there are really three things that it makes me think about. One, the intersectionality with our diversity, equity, and inclusion work, right? This is really about changing our mindset, right? What does it mean to recruit, to hire, to evaluate with the right cultural competencies? It's the same thing, right? So when we think about our trans and queer students who are leaving, who are dropping out, who are even transferring to other institutions that may not be as welcoming, right, or not as safe as the campus that they came from. And I have heard a number of stories when our students make that transition to a four-year institution. They're then faced again with confronting a historical, marginalization of their identities. And then for us, we're in the middle of a historic enrollment challenge. So as we think about this, we must center our leaders in our campuses as a part of the solution. That is our diversity, equity, and inclusion work. And next month, the Board of Governors will hear regulation change statewide. It will make history. And at the core of it is really, how are we preparing our faculty and staff to be culturally competent? To be culturally competent. There are so many other work sites that have done this before. The health profession, even the Catholic Church, the military. So we are not too far off of where we need to be. It's really about better supporting them. But it's really important that we understand that the real work is about helping see people's humanity and making them feel safe. So much like a Lavender graduation, it's also about celebrating and empowering those who are showing up as themselves every day, right? And thanking them, but also more importantly, legitimizing them, right? Don't thank me because I chose to, be myself. A lot of people put themselves in harm's way and in order to create change, but it shouldn't take that. And so a big piece of the work is really how we hire, who we recruit, where we go and recruit, the requirements of when we are hiring, and then more recently, what we're asking our system to do, which is the evaluations and tenure work, which is we in this system will now expect you to be culturally competent. And that includes better serving our LGBTQ plus students. The other big part of the work that we need to do as a system is really thinking about that integration. And I know, we're probably going to talk about finances later on, but every single part of an LGBTQ plus student's journey, there's really one end goal for them in mind. They want to get to their end goal of success. Sometimes it's transfer, sometimes it's a certificate, sometimes it's enough units to be able to just transfer, sometimes it's an ADT, right? All of that is about success. And so for us as a system is the next big part of the journey is about centering our student success through our own finances. That's a student-centered funding formula. It is not any different for who we're serving. I think as I think about the word movement and what you all are doing today as a summit today and what we need to do every single day, it shouldn't just be about 2 days, right? Every single day, it's about empowering our faculty and staff, no matter what their role is, in a campus. It's about legitimizing them, which means seeing them and respecting them. And then the other piece that I think is really important is about community. There is nothing more powerful like convening statewide, but doing that at the local level. And we know that from working with other marginalized communities, that when we create the space, people will show up. When I was a student, there were only 13 women of color at the campus that I went to when I finally transferred from community colleges. And there were very few faculty of color. I can't even remember how many provosts or deans were actually people of color, but that was just the beginning part of it. So what I did was create a coalition between faculty, staff, and students. And we created a place called the Solidarity Lounge, where we could all convene regardless of what our identity was. And we started with just literally one laptop, a couch, a little tiny refrigerator, and it became the space where people could bring speakers. We could all learn together. And I mention that here because it's as simple as that, right? That's what it means to respect people. That's what it means to really do the cultural work on a campus and developing and nurturing our faculty and staff. It's that simple.
Yeah, I think what you're really talking about as well is sort of the important role of things like employee resource groups, right? Where we bring folks together. We're very lucky to have one in Los Rios. And I've served in that for a while, and the ability to come together as a community when things get hard, because we know there's additional labor associated with being a member of a marginalized community. And if we are privileged enough to stand at the front of something, right, we're a leader in some way, that also comes with great responsibility. And we become the touch point for many of our students who share that marginalized community with us. And that is additional labor and additional work. And then we are confronted with things on our own campuses, right? Microaggressions or being delegitimized or any of those things. And having a place of community where you can say, you know, today was a really hard day.
Yeah.
This thing happened and I don't really know what to do with that. And having folks around you be like, yeah, I hear you. Or for those folks who have ascended to the higher levels, hey, do you want to work on this project with me? It would be really great to get your input. And I think, you know, we really do need to always be focused on what's going on with our students and providing them with community, but recognizing that we have to feed that in us too, right? We have to be on the employee side of that, a space where we find community as well. And so I appreciate you bringing that up and talking about that important role in retaining and recruiting. Who are we talking to about these jobs? How do we expect people to show up for these jobs? Right? What are the things we're doing? What do we expect? I think about this particularly with our gender nonconforming, non-binary, and trans folks, right? Are we a welcoming workplace environment when folks apply to these jobs?
Yeah. And it's more than just having a statement at the bottom. It's how did you describe the duties? And then more importantly, when you're reviewing those applications, are you using gender terms? You know, I am a sociologist by training, and that was one of the first things that I did for our state agency, because there are so many gender terms in everything that we do. And whether we know it or not, our biases show up. And that influences whether we believe someone belongs or should be provided a chance to even interview, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's so powerful. It's so important, and it's so unseen, right? It's so a part of our culture, or, you know, the water in the fishbowl, right? What's water? We can't even see it, right? Because it infiltrates every part of our experience. And, you know, I'm 47 years old. How much I've had to unlearn from a culture that told you this is as far as you can go. This is the trades you have to make, right? And this just continues to be true. And until we take the deep dive, look really deeply, highlight the gendered language where it doesn't need to be, stop dividing our classrooms into girls and boys, right? Those kinds of things.
There's scholars and leaders.
That's right.
Scholars and leaders.
Colleagues and friends. That's
yes.
Absolutely. So thank you for that. I appreciate that. So you brought it up about funding, and I said we would circle back to this. And you also mentioned enrollment, which is, of course, a very important component of the student-centered funding formula, in the sense that at least 50% is based basically on how many our enrollment, our FTE, right? So how do you envision serving queer and trans students? How does that fit in really to the student-centered funding formula? We know right now everybody's sort of in this hold harmless, but that's not going to last forever. So how do we as a system, as individual colleges, districts, whatever, really think about how we are embedded in this? Because oftentimes what this comes down to a conversation about is dollars, not between you and I, but in all of those meetings, we all know eventually it comes down to dollars. So you really illuminated that one of the things we need to do is case making, right? And an important part of case making is the dollars. So how do you see serving queer and trans students being embedded in that student-centered funding formula, which is a powerful argument for why we need the funding, right?
Well, first and foremost, let me just clarify that no one is being harmed. It is a technical term in
Oh,
education
sorry.
finance. No, yeah, I like to start there because
Yeah.
the language is really from our education code, and it's education finance language. What it means to be held harmless, it really means that while our declining enrollment is going down, none of our colleges will lose funding. That's really what it means. So everyone is protected, right? But we are at the point where we need to be ready, and we have had a long time to start to get ready to think about the implementation of the student-centered funding formula. Nationwide, people are looking at us. They're thinking about how do they learn from California in centering equity, even in their funding formula. So for those who are new to this topic, for many years, we had a model where it was based on just on what we call butts and seats, or our base allocation, which is just enrollment period. We just needed to count full-time equivalent students. And 100% of the formula was that. Under the student center funding formula, it's now been changed a little bit. I like to mention that a little bit. 70% is still just based on enrollment. The other 20% is supplemental, and that's really looking at the intersectionality of class. Really, who are those students that are harder to serve because they are low income? These are our Pell, DACA, AB 540 students, right? That intersectionality of a student's reality. And the last 10%, so it was 70, 20, 10, the last 10% are what we call the success allocation metrics. There are 8 of them. They're all based on momentum points, how we measure student success, an associate degree for transfer, whether a college helped a student get an AA degree, whether they got a baccalaureate degree, whether they earned a certificate, whether they took transfer math and level English in year 1, whether they actually transferred to a 4-year institution, or they earned 9 credits for a career technical education unit. And then, of course, the 8th one, which is, did they earn a living wage after they got their education? The thing that they have in common, and why and how we are serving LGBTQ plus students and centering our students in this formula, is that no matter what your identity is, this formula incentivizes our colleges to really focus on student success. It's designed to create the incentives for student success as a primary incentive for design and implementation, period. So it's no longer about getting you that parking spot so that you can actually show up to your class in the first few months of the class. And then, then you have to start to pay for parking after the first month and a half. That's not what it's about. It's about making sure that every single one of our students can get there and that we're measuring the right data, the right momentum points. It's not the solution. It is a tool. And that's really important to keep in mind.
Yeah. Well, thank you, first of all, for giving a more thorough explanation of the student-centered let me try that again. Student-centered funding formula. That's a lot of words all at once. And the whole idea of the hold harmless. So I appreciate that, because it can seem very punitive and kind of confusing and not really sure how that works. And one of the things that I really thought about is if you look at that 10% that's allocated to those success measures, right? All of them, if you're thinking about queer and trans students, are dependent upon an environment that is welcoming and affirming to your identity. You are much less likely to complete your math and English in the first year if you do not feel like you can go to the counseling department and be affirmed in your identity. If you cannot live on campus with your affirmed or lived name, you are far less likely to transfer because you're just not coming back. If there are not mental health services that are welcoming, that are affirming of your community, right, and accessible to you, those can often be actually life and death decisions, right? Those are life and death types of situations. When we think about enrollment, right, this is really where I think of as a very important place for us to be doing very strategic and directed outreach to our high school campuses, our feeder campuses, and for those that have things like GSAs or other kinds of community groups on their high schools, to let folks know there's a pipeline. Right? You can come here and we see you, and showing up, right, at those high schools and saying, we see you, we are here for you. And more importantly, we want you. We see your potential. We need you. We need you. We are better together, right? We need you. And so every aspect of that, and even in the ways in which we think about, economically disadvantaged folks. The research shows the LGBTQ plus community is overrepresented. For example, queer women are twice as likely to get SNAP benefits than their heterosexual female counterparts, twice as likely, right? The most food insecure individuals are Black trans women, right? Who's got, all of those things. So, and it's really illuminating the ways in which we have to do this work. We have to,
Yeah.
right? It is an imperative. And if it's not a moral imperative for you, it is a financial imperative for the system, right?
I
For
think,
those, yeah.
Yeah, I think, if there was one wish for this summit, as I think about this, is that people would come out making the connections that you just made. Making the connections gives us clarity. And with clarity, no matter what type of discomfort we face, we know our mission and we can say, I need help, right? Or we can turn to the person next to us and say, I can't do this on my own, right? Like maybe I'm not the right person. But I love that. So as we think about this summit, making the connections that you just made, it's about the urgency. It's about all of this working together as an ecosystem. And at the core of that is being able to see people's humanity, creating and designing with them at the table, and then executing only to then do better, right?
Yes. Oh, the power of having the voices at the table, right? If you're not at the table, you're on the table.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
So let's get folks at the table so we can all be having the conversation because we don't know everything, right?
Yeah, you can't say in this system that you're doing DIA work if you don't understand the impact and the role of LGBTQ plus students. Then that's not DIA work, right? Then that's not equity work.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you. I know we only have a little bit more time together. I would take up your whole day if you let me, I can assure you. And I do now have your email, so that's dangerous for you. But I did want to just sort of ask, what do you want to know more about? Where are you? Because we can't live in every community. We don't always know. So what do you need to know more? How can we better serve the state chancellor's office to help further this work, to fill in the gaps on knowledge or structure or whatever? What can we do to serve you all, to serve us?
So I would say three. I like to think in threes, and my team knows that about me. But I mean, number one is, as you think about this summit, think about the intersectionality of a student's life and how you then begin to be that bridge across programs, across associations, with colleagues. One really important case that came up to me last year and where I learned a lot from our students, there was a specific student who transferred over to UC, and I won't mention which one, and reached out to our office and said, my community college was very supportive of me and they understood what it meant for a first generation undocumented transgender student to attend. And this individual mentioned it took 4 years to help my campus realize that and change their own professional development and training. But here was the challenge that this individual then faced. He attended a UC and immediately was told, we need appropriate documentation from your country of origin with your birth certificate with the right gender. Well, the country that this individual was associated with saw him as a he. Right? And it was a lot more complicated, and it was really complicated because they felt unsafe about going back. They would have had to leave the country and they were undocumented, right? Then they're not seen as their true selves nor recognized. So the infrastructure does not exist. And the financial aid office in this other system kept saying, there's nothing we can do. You're going to have to drop out. What is really important for us as we think about this work and as the leaders, the adults in the room, is that is our job, removing the barriers. So when I say be the bridge and the handoff to other institutions, think about your own professional development on your campus. I'll tell you the end of the story because it ended really amazing. I empower the student to write to the president of the campus, the president of the system, and CC a specific regent, aka Chancellor Oakley. The student then went on to lead training at that specific campus as an intern for the president's office at that campus. And they're about to graduate this May with a bachelor's degree.
That's amazing.
So the story that I want to share with you is be the bridge, empower students, right? So as I think about your question, what do I want to know? We need help, and I want to know how you are that bridge and what resources you need to get there, right? Especially if there are barriers on the other end. We need to do a lot more work as we think about the self-doubt, the barriers that our students face. And so I want folks to really think about how do we create spaces of empowerment. Perhaps it's through statewide professional development, a learning community at the statewide level on this topic, a listening tour, campus visits, so many examples. So I want to know what is the best way to engage you and how do I help you remove barriers? How does our staff and our office help? I want to learn a little bit more about the innovative ideas to create those connections. Sometimes it'll be federal law, sometimes it'll be accreditation. All of those are not excuses. For me, a no is a very slow maybe. And that is the mentality that I want all of us to have as we really commit to making sure that this is not a moment, it's a movement, and that we understand that we are not reforming. We're not just scraping off the top, we are transforming. And I think this community understands that. They understand what it means to transform because they have to be themselves, but yet different, depending on where they enter and where they are not welcomed, where they are not wanted, and where they don't feel safe.
Yeah, that's really, I want to go to point one because it really resonated for me, this idea of a bridge. And we talked a little bit about outreach and how that's really, and so thinking about the ways in which we can be intimately integrated into our outreach policies around high school students, but then also the other way, right? So how are we partnering with our four-year university partners when our folks transfer on, if that's what they want to do, right? Many are going to, and ensuring that there is a bridge that way too. And I cannot speak for everybody in the system, but I will speak for my own system. We probably don't do as good a job as we should on the follow-up of experiences that our students are having, and really partnering our, California Community College system with our CSUs and our UCs in this collaborative work effort, right? So it's sort of a whole student, whole person wraparound, right? How are we taking them in from K through 12? How are we moving them through our system, right? And then how are we also ensuring that up and down, right, our students are getting what they need to be successful in this world? And that, for me personally, really resonated for me. And I think we could all do a better job of that. And I definitely think that's an area where we could collaborate much more closely with the state chancellor's office in thinking about how to be holistically involved up and down, for lack of a better word, the chain.
And we don't have to go far, right, to look at the priorities, right? As I think about in the emails that I've gotten just in the last 2 years, for our LGBTQ plus students, what it'll mean to be unapologetic is entering spaces like Veterans Resource Centers, right? Again, when you look at your data, when you hear from students, you don't have to go far. A lot of communities, particularly in the Latino and African American communities, our students don't feel safe, and that's a cultural issue, right? From their families, from the community around them. So how do we begin to bridge the gap? So for example, I'm thinking about, yes, we have $15,000 per college, and that's great.
Sure.
But how does MESA, how does EOPS, how does Next Up come to the table to have joint events, co-create together? That is what we would love to hear more about. Because in that we're talking about a transformation. Then we're talking about transforming the system by helping to bring people together and then redesigning for success.
Yeah, thank you. Well, thank you so much. Truly, thank you for this conversation. I found it very enlightening, also very empowering. I hope that was the same for you as well. I appreciate you making this time. I appreciate you being at the summit in this virtual form. Of course, we would welcome you in the future as well. So thank you again from the bottom of my heart. I appreciate you.
Thank you. And thank you, everyone. Have a great summit.
All right, so we're just waiting for those slides to get up and running because clearly I should not be in charge of slides. That is clearly not anybody's best interest. So again, I just want to extend a thank you to Dr. Gonzalez for showing up for that. I will tell you a little side story while we get those slides up and running. And I shared this with Sal. We were talking a little bit before, Dr. Gonzalez and I were talking a little before the interview. And I said, oh, I just want to know how I should address you and those kinds of things. And I wanted to make sure that I had spelled her name correctly. And most of you will see that her name is Dr. Gonzalez and her last name is with an S. And she shared with me that, in fact, when she was born, the nurse did not know how to spell Gonzalez. And so put an S instead of a Z. And as she already alluded to, she began her early life actually in the foster care system, and no one noticed.
Yeah.
Her parents' last name is Gonzalez spelled with a Z, and her last name is Gonzalez spelled with an S because no one saw her. Right. And I just want that to set in for a moment because I believe that is how so many of our students feel. They just feel unseen and the consequences of that to them as individuals.
Yeah, that's such a sad story, right? Because how many of our students, don't go through similar situations, right? Especially when they don't have someone there to be there of support for them. So that's why when you told me the story at first, it was so tragic for me. It just like, I got tears in my eyes because I'm like, what would it have been if there would have been somebody there to be able to advocate for her in those situations. Yet, look at where she's at. Look at all the amazing things she's doing, right? And so it really speaks about true resilience. And I'm sure somewhere along the way, there was some form of support there for her that really helped, made all the difference. It doesn't seem like the slides are gonna work. We are having a lot of technical difficulties, but I do want to remind everyone that I keep posting on the chat, our Instagram and our Facebook social media handles. So make sure you add us. We want you to follow us. We want you to stay up to date with all the news about our summit. But without further ado, because there it is. We got it working. Yay! We did.
I touch nothing.
We're imperfect human beings. That's okay. That's what happens. Vulnerability is at the core of everything that we do when we're trying to create something new. So that's totally fine. So again, use your phones, right? Use your phone, hover over and use our QR codes to also follow us. And also, if you would like to be part of next year's summit as a committee member, and you're willing to put in the work as well that it will take to be a part of this committee to help make this possible, please use the QR code that's right there. And without further ado, I do want to toss it back to Emily because I know we're short with time.
Yeah, absolutely. If we could just advance slides, Mark, just because I want to just go over what we're going to talk about next. Right, if not, no big deal. So we're going to turn it over to two folks to talk about some legislation that's in front of the legislature right now, specifically AB 2315, which would require that all California community colleges by the academic year 2023-24 to create a system by which students can indicate an affirmed name and gender to be used on all records where legal names are not required by law. So these are things like rosters, ID cards, diplomas, etc. And before I turn it over to our distinguished guests, David O'Brien from the State Chancellor's Office and Stephanie Goldman from the Faculty Association of California Community Colleges to discuss this, I just want to give people some understanding of how important the ability to live with one's affirmed name is. So in a study from the University of Texas, Austin in 2018, they found that youth who could use their affirmed name at school, work, home, and with friends experienced 71% fewer symptoms of severe depression, a 34% decrease in reported thoughts of suicide, and a 65% decrease in suicidal attempts compared to peers who could not use their affirmed name. So let us never forget that this is in fact life or death legislation. So I'd now like to turn it over to our esteemed colleagues, David O'Brien and Stephanie Goldman.
Good morning. So happy to be here. I'm Stephanie Goldman. I'm the Associate Director of the Faculty Association of California Community Colleges. My pronouns are she, her, and I identify as queer/chaotic bisexual.
Thank you. Good morning. I'm David O'Brien, Vice Chancellor for Government Relations here at the California Community Colleges. Pronouns he, him, and nobody would accuse me of being anything less than chaotic.
You're ridiculous. So we're really excited to be here. AB 2315 is just an incredible piece of legislation. This actually came to the Faculty Association from staff members who dealt with some issues on their own campuses. Every year, FAC holds these these legislative work groups where we talk about issues that are being faced by our members. And a couple of our members at a certain campus identified as transgender, and when they started going by their affirmed names or their chosen names, they actually experienced a significant, and I mean significant, amount of pushback from the administrators. They had to really battle to be able to use this, and this extends down to our students, our administrators. We wanted to make sure that we did something to keep this from ever happening again, because if you don't get the right to go by your name, your affirmed name, it can have incredibly detrimental effects on your mental health, as well as your career and your ability to move forward. And I think a lot of us know here, it's not easy to change your name, particularly your first name. It's incredibly difficult. It requires resources, time, and things that not everybody has, particularly when we're talking about our students. So AB 2315 is being authored by Assemblymember Dr. Arambula. It's being co-authored by Assemblymember Evan Lowe, who is the chair of the LGBTQ caucus. It would essentially require every community college campus to allow students, faculty, and staff, so we're going well beyond just students here, to use their affirmed name. David?
Thank you, Stephanie. I really want to thank FAC for leading this effort, which is so critical. And I want to thank the organizers for making time for us to have this discussion here today. The Community Colleges Chancellor's Office is very pleased to support AB 2315. And I think it goes back to a lot of what my boss, Dr. Daisy Gonzalez, was saying earlier that, at the beginning during her interview, which is it relates to why an inclusive and welcoming campus environment is so important. Right, we've talked about this a lot in the context of basic needs. Right, I assume I'm mostly speaking to folks who are familiar about this here. But when we talk about why, for instance, addressing food insecurity or housing insecurity is so important, it's because it's pretty common sense that a student who's wondering where their next meal is going to be coming from is not a student who's in a position to succeed in college. A student who's wondering if they're going to have a bed to sleep on that night, or if they're going to be sleeping in their car again, is not a student who's positioned well to succeed in college. But more and more in recent years, through our work on diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility, as Dr. Gonzalez mentioned, we've learned really about the mental health components of student success and how it's so important to address things like microaggressions, which historically, in recent years, we've mostly talked about in the context of racial equity, and that is obviously critically important. Most folks here are probably aware that it's Mental Health Action Week in the California Community Colleges. And earlier this week, I had the pleasure of moderating a wonderful discussion where we talked about the importance of addressing things to ensure that students have access to mental health services on campus and in their community, in large part around things like microaggressions, right? But when you think about those microaggressions and what those mean to students, that can include things like dead naming, right? And a student who's subject to those, who faces that discrimination, is simply not a student who's in a position to succeed and pursue their dreams of a higher education. That's going to hold them back. I remember Stephanie and I were talking earlier this week because I remembered some headlines a few years ago about one of our four-year partners who was, and may still, I'm not naming anybody, but they may still, or they certainly were, dead naming students, refusing to use their affirmed name in their graduation ceremony, which is awful, of course. But then you think about, when you look at something like AB 2315, imagine a student who never even gets that far, who never even gets to graduation because of the discrimination that they've faced throughout their attempts at a higher education before that, right? And that starts with dead naming, which denies individuals one of their most fundamental rights, right? Dr. Mitchell talked about earlier, which is the right to your own identity, the right to your personhood, the right to be who you are and identify who you are and be that person publicly. So I just want to say, for the Chancellor's Office, supporting AB 2315 was a no-brainer, because we know that when we help students, as well as faculty and staff, as Stephanie noted, feel welcomed and included on their campus, that's how they will succeed and thrive. And it starts with basic things like that. There's been a lot of conversations in our system in the last few years about holding ourselves accountable for student outcomes. One of the most fundamental ways we can do that is ensure that everybody is welcomed and feels included and recognized on campus. Stephanie?
Thanks, David. And we really do appreciate the Chancellor's Office's support on this issue, because this is super important. Touching on the mental health issue a little bit, we're seeing more and more research come out. When I started working on this bill, when this bill was just an idea back in the fall, I had a pretty good amount of research that came out of California specifically about homelessness, basic needs, education issues faced by our students who identify as transgender. However, in the process of sort of getting this bill through the legislative process, more information has come out. I just got a report last week that says more than half, 55% of transgender people say their mental health was not good all or most of the time while they were actually in higher education programs. And that's really, really concerning. More than a third experienced bullying, harassment, or assault while they were enrolled in higher ed. And transgender people were more than three times more likely than cisgender LGBTQ people to say that lifetime adverse treatment at school ended up actually impacting their academic success. So this is this is huge. We really need to make sure that we're supporting our students, faculty, and staff on this. In addition to coming here to talk about this bill, I also wanted to quickly plug that this bill is a fantastic example of what happens when folks on their campus see a problem and they want to kind of find a solution. Groups like FAC or even the Chancellor's Office, we run bills to try to make the system better, to recognize these inequities, and to try to resolve them as best that we can. So I do want to just remind everybody on this summit that you can make a huge difference. Even if you just have an idea, bring it to someone like me or David, and we can do what we, see what we can do. Now, as far as where this bill is headed, it passed its Assembly Higher Education Committee, which was great. We didn't have any opposition. I'm assuming it's going to go to appropriations. And then we're going to see, and then it'll go to the floor. When it does get to the floor, that's when we can really use a lot of support. So I'll drop FAC's website into the chat, and you can check that when you want to see what's going on with each of these bills.
Thank you, Stephanie. Yeah, and I, to the point that you made there about needing support from folks in the audience, I was there at the Assembly Higher Education Committee when the bill was presented and voted out. But, I think even in a progressive or more progressive maybe than the country as a whole, state like California, there are still folks that just aren't informed about these issues and why it's so important. There were some questions from some members of the Assembly Higher Education Committee about this problem you're describing about naming and people not being called the name they want. Is this a real problem? Are you sure? And just a lot of skepticism. It came out more as ignorance than as a prejudice, but it still just showed a lack of awareness and information. So I would say, just offers my piece of advice, those of you that want to help support this, to the extent you're comfortable sharing your personal story with your local policymakers, legislators, please go ahead and do so, because they need to know that this is a problem that as we hopefully move towards becoming a more welcoming and inclusive society for everyone, it will come out more and more that there are people whose affirmed identity doesn't match the name they were assigned at birth and want to exercise that right to have their own name that matches their identity. And they need to have the freedom and the ability to do so. And so I'm also going to pop in the chat, if I could, and ask everybody if you want to learn more from the Chancellor's Office as well about the legislation we're supporting. Our advocates listserv, we update pretty regularly, and we would encourage everybody to do so. But I also just want to once again thank our organizers for making space for this incredible discussion.
Of course, no, thank you so much both for being here. I think we wanted to include this part in the summit because we understand that this is so crucial. This is something I'm constantly dealing with at my college, at El Camino College, so thank you. No, thanks to you for coming here and bringing some light into this. We are running a little bit behind, so I do have to move forward, but thank you so much, David and Stephanie, for coming in. We love having you both, so thank you so much. The other thing I want to do, make an announcement before we head off to the breakout sessions, because we are running behind, is I just want to remind everybody to complete your surveys that's actually available through the Summit app. And completing the survey, we forgot to say this yesterday, but if you complete the survey, you can enter the chance of a drawing for $100 Amazon gift card. And who doesn't love Amazon, right? So please be sure to complete the survey. Make sure you go into our app. Thank you again, Emily. We'll see you all at the breakout sessions. Have a good one.